Go away, you old. That was the first thing I saw when I walked into my granddaughter's 15th birthday party, printed in glittery pink letters across a banner stretched over the backyard fence. For a moment, I thought I had misread it. Maybe the words meant something else. Maybe it was part of some joke I didn't understand. But I stood there at the edge of the patio with my gift bag in my hand and realized the rest of the sentence didn't need to be finished for me to understand exactly who it was meant for. I'm glad you're here listening to my story, and if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why that banner changed the way I see my own family forever. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 67 years old, a retired elementary school librarian from Columbus, Ohio, and that afternoon I had spent nearly an hour getting ready because my granddaughter Sophie was turning 15. 15 is a big deal for a girl. I still remember when she was born, pink and tiny and angry at the world, gripping my finger with a strength that surprised everyone in the delivery room. I remember rocking her to sleep in the old wooden chair in my son Daniel's living room when he and Melissa were still living in that cramped townhouse on the west side. I remember first days of kindergarten, piano recitals, scraped knees, and every birthday cake in between. That morning I had wrapped her gift carefully on my kitchen table. Inside the silver paper was a delicate necklace with a small sapphire pendant, the same shade of blue as Sophie's eyes. It had belonged to my mother once, and before that to my grandmother. I had always imagined passing it down to Sophie when she reached an age where she might understand what family traditions mean. The party was being held in Daniel and Melissa's backyard, about 20 minutes from my house. As I pulled into the driveway, I could already hear the music and laughter drifting over the fence. Colorful balloons were tied to the mailbox, and a long table under a white canopy was covered with cupcakes, soda bottles, and bright pink decorations. Everything looked festive, cheerful, exactly the kind of party a 15-year-old girl would dream about. I smoothed the front of my light blue dress, the one with the pearl buttons, and picked up the gift bag from the passenger seat. For a moment I stood there, taking a breath and feeling proud of the young woman Sophie was becoming. Then I walked through the open gate into the backyard. That's when I saw the banner. The letters were large, sparkling in the afternoon sunlight, impossible to ignore. A few teenagers stood nearby holding plastic cups of lemonade. One of them glanced at me and then quickly looked away. Another girl whispered something to her friend, and both of them suddenly became very interested in their phones. I felt my steps slow without meaning to. The music kept playing. People kept talking. But something in the air shifted, like a conversation had stopped just before I walked in. My son Daniel was standing near the grill with a pair of tongs in his hand. He looked up when he saw me, and for a brief second our eyes met. Then he looked at the banner. Then he looked down at the grill again. My daughter-in-law Melissa was greeting a group of parents near the patio table, smiling brightly, the way she always does when she's playing the perfect host. She glanced at me too, just for a moment, and her smile didn't change at all, not even a flicker. I stood there holding Sophie's gift and realized something that felt heavier than the words on that banner. No one had taken it down. Not my son. Not my daughter-in-law. Not anyone else at the party. And in that quiet second, with balloons swaying above the yard and music floating through the speakers, I understood that the banner wasn't a mistake. It was a message, and everyone here had already decided to pretend it was perfectly normal. I kept walking because stopping would have made it worse. There are moments in life when you understand that dignity is not about what other people say to you, but about how quietly you continue standing. My shoes clicked softly against the stone patio, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The banner was still behind me, fluttering gently in the warm Ohio breeze, its glitter catching the sunlight as though it were part of the decorations. A few teenagers moved aside as I approached the main table. Someone had set up a large pink cake with white frosting roses, and the number 15 in silver candles. It was beautiful, the kind of cake that takes hours to decorate, the kind of cake that tells everyone this day is supposed to be special. Sophie was standing near the pool with 3 of her friends. She looked taller than the last time I had seen her, her long brown hair curled carefully over her shoulders, wearing a pale lavender dress that shimmered slightly in the afternoon light. I had helped pay for that dress 2 weeks earlier when Melissa said the one Sophie wanted was a little too expensive. Sophie saw me then. For a moment our eyes met. There was a flicker of something in her expression that I could not quite name. Embarrassment perhaps, or uncertainty. She gave a small wave, The kind you give to someone across a grocery store aisle rather than to your grandmother who used to read you bedtime stories. I lifted the silver gift bag slightly and smiled back as though nothing unusual had happened. Daniel was still at the grill. The smell of hamburgers drifted through the air along with the sweet scent of vanilla frosting. He cleared his throat when I approached him. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly without looking directly at me. His voice sounded careful, as if each word had been measured before it left his mouth. "Hello, Daniel," I replied. "The weather is beautiful for a party." "Yes, it is," he answered. He turned one of the burgers with the metal spatula and watched the grill instead of me. I waited a moment, thinking perhaps he would say something about the banner, or call someone over to remove it, or at least acknowledge that it existed. But the only sound was the quiet sizzle of meat on the grill and distant laughter from the teenagers by the pool. Melissa walked over carrying a tray of lemonade glasses. Her smile was perfectly polished. "Evelyn, you made it," she said warmly as though greeting a neighbor. "I was beginning to wonder if you were running late." "Traffic was light," I said. I held out the gift bag slightly. "I brought something for Sophie." "How thoughtful," Melissa replied, setting the tray down on the table. She did not look toward the banner. She did not look uncomfortable. Instead, she adjusted one of the cupcake stands and turned back toward the guests gathering near the canopy. Everything about her movements said that this afternoon was unfolding exactly as planned. A man I recognized from Daniel neighborhood stepped forward and shook my hand politely. "Nice party they have here," he said. "Yes, it certainly is," I answered. Around us, the celebration continued with the easy rhythm of suburban birthdays. Children splashed in the pool. Music drifted from a small speaker near the patio door. Someone began passing out slices of watermelon on paper plates. Yet beneath the cheerful noise, there was a quiet tension I could feel in the way people glanced briefly toward the fence and then quickly looked away. The banner remained there like an unspoken sentence hanging in the air. I rested my hand lightly on the gift bag and realized something slowly settling into place inside my chest. The words on that banner had not surprised everyone. Only me. Someone handed Sophie a microphone near the pool, and the music lowered slightly as the teenagers gathered around her. She laughed nervously and brushed a curl away from her face while her friends crowded closer, holding their phones ready to record the moment. 15 years old is an age when every second feels important, every laugh louder, every embarrassment larger than life. I stood near the patio table holding the small silver gift bag and watched her from across the yard, remembering a much smaller girl who once insisted on wearing a plastic princess crown to the grocery store because she believed every birthday meant she was royalty for the day. Back then she would run to me the moment I walked through the door, arms open, voice bright, calling out "Grandma" before I even had time to take off my coat. Now she stood with her friends, half smiling in my direction but not quite stepping forward. Melissa clapped her hands to gather attention and said it was time for Sophie to thank everyone for coming. The microphone squeaked softly before Sophie spoke. She thanked her parents first, then her friends, then the neighbors who had helped set up the party earlier that morning. The words sounded polite and practiced, the kind of speech a teenager might rehearse in front of a mirror. While she spoke, I looked around the yard again, noticing the decorations more carefully. Pink streamers hung from the canopy. A row of balloons shaped like silver. Stars floated near the fence. There were trays of cookies, bowls of chips, pitchers of lemonade sweating in the heat. Someone had spent real time and effort planning this celebration. Melissa moved easily among the guests, refilling glasses, straightening plates, laughing at small jokes as though hosting parties like this was second nature. From the outside, it was a perfect afternoon in a quiet American neighborhood. Yet every so often someone would glance toward the far side of the yard where the banner still hung. Each glance lasted only a second, but it was enough. A small pause, a shift of the eyes. Then the conversation would continue as if nothing unusual existed at all. Daniel eventually stepped away from the grill and wiped his hands on a towel. He joined a group of fathers discussing football scores and summer travel plans. His voice sounded relaxed now, almost cheerful, and I wondered if he had already convinced himself that ignoring the banner meant it would stop existing. I had known my son his entire life. I knew the way he avoided conflict, the way he believed silence could smooth over anything uncomfortable. It was the same habit he had when he was a boy and accidentally broke something in the house. He would simply leave the room and hope the problem solved itself. Sophie finished her speech and the guests applauded. Melissa lit the candles on the cake while everyone sang the birthday song. The flames flickered brightly against the afternoon light, and Sophie leaned forward to blow them out while her friends cheered. Cameras flashed. Laughter filled the yard again. I smiled politely with the others, but as the applause faded, I noticed something small that settled deeper than the banner itself. When Sophie began opening gifts a few minutes later, Melissa quietly moved a folding chair to the other side of the table, so I would be standing farther away from the photographs. No one said anything about it. No one needed to. The message was clear in the gentle rearranging of space. The party would continue exactly as planned, and I would simply exist somewhere just outside the frame. For a while I remained near the patio table, holding the silver gift bag and watching the rhythm of the party move around me like a current I was no longer part of. Sophie sat in the folding chair beside the cake while her friends gathered close, handing her brightly wrapped packages and laughing each time she held something up for them to see. Someone had set up a small phone on a tripod to record everything. Melissa leaned in from time to time, adjusting ribbons or smoothing the tablecloth so the pictures would look perfect. The whole scene had the polished feeling of a moment designed to be remembered. I stepped forward when there was a small pause between gifts and gently placed my bag on the table. Sophie glanced up at me again. Her smile was polite, the kind people give when they are not sure how they are supposed to behave. "Thank you, Grandma," she said softly before placing the bag beside the other presents without opening it. One of her friends immediately passed her another box wrapped in bright pink paper, and the attention of the group shifted away again. I stepped back without saying anything. Standing there, I began noticing other small things that had seemed harmless before, but now felt different. Last Thanksgiving, Melissa had rearranged the seating, so I ended up at the far end of the dining room table near the kitchen doorway, while the younger families sat together in the center. At the time she laughed, and said it would make it easier for me to reach the serving dishes. The Christmas before that, the family photo had been taken quickly in the front yard while I was inside hanging up my coat. When I stepped outside, everyone was already walking back into the house, and Melissa said they would take another one later, but somehow that second picture never happened. Even smaller moments came back to me now. The way Melissa sometimes introduced me to new neighbors as Daniel's mother instead of Sophie's grandmother, as if my place in the family tree had slowly shifted backward. The way conversations would pause for a second when I entered a room and then restart on a slightly different topic. At the time, I had dismissed those moments as ordinary misunderstandings. Families are complicated, I told myself. People get busy. Teenagers grow distant. It was easier to believe that explanation than to consider anything else. But standing in that backyard now, with the decorations swaying gently above the tables and the banner still hanging untouched along the fence, those old memories began to line up in a different pattern. It was like looking at puzzle pieces that had been scattered for years and suddenly realizing they fit together in a way I had not wanted to see before. Daniel walked past me carrying a tray of sodas and gave me a quick smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Melissa laughed with two mothers from Sophie's school near the pool while explaining how much work it had taken to organize the party. The guests continued chatting. The teenagers continued filming short videos, and the celebration carried on with cheerful energy. Yet beneath that surface I could feel something settling quietly inside my chest. The banner had not appeared out of nowhere. It had grown out of many smaller moments, small enough to ignore on their own, but clear when placed side by side. And the longer I stood there watching the party unfold, the more certain I became that this afternoon had been planned very carefully. I picked up a glass of lemonade from the table, mostly to give my hands something to do. The ice cubes clinked softly against the sides as I moved toward the edge of the yard where the shade from a tall maple tree made the air feel cooler. From there I could see almost everything without standing directly in the center of the crowd. Sophie and her friends had begun taking pictures together, holding up peace signs and leaning their heads close, while the small phone on the tripod recorded short videos for social media. Melissa hovered nearby, guiding them gently, making sure the decorations stayed in the background of every shot. She had always been very careful about appearances. I had noticed that about her from the first year Daniel introduced us. Appearances mattered more than explanations. As I watched, a quiet voice beside me said my name. Evelyn. I turned and saw Carol standing there with a paper plate holding a slice of cake she had barely touched. Carol was Daniel's aunt, my late husband's younger sister, and one of the few people in the family who still spoke plainly. Her gray hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her expression carried the kind of concern that people try to hide in public places. "I wondered if you saw it," she said quietly. I glanced toward the fence without answering. The banner was still moving slightly in the breeze. It would be difficult for anyone not to see it. Carol let out a slow breath. "I thought someone might take it down before you arrived." No one did. Her voice was gentle but direct, the way it had always been when the family gathered for holidays and small tensions hovered just beneath the surface of conversation. I took a sip of lemonade before speaking. "It is a colorful decoration," I said calmly. Carol gave a soft, tired smile. "Evelyn, you know what I mean." She shifted her weight and lowered her voice even further so the nearby guests could not hear. "The decorations for this party arrived 3 days ago. I helped Melissa bring some of the boxes from the garage. The banner was already in one of them." I felt the cool glass in my hand grow heavier as the words settled between us. "Already in the box," I repeated quietly. Carol nodded. "I thought it was a joke at first. Teenagers sometimes have strange humor. But when I asked Melissa about it, she said it was part of the theme Sophie friends came up with online." She paused before adding another sentence. "Then she said it would be better not to make a big deal about it." Across the yard, Sophie laughed loudly as one of her friends tried to balance a cupcake on the edge of a plastic cup. The sound floated toward us like nothing in the world had changed. I watched Daniel walk past the banner carrying another tray of drinks without even glancing at it. Carol followed my gaze. "He knows it is there," she said quietly. "I told him earlier this morning that maybe it should not go up." "What did he say?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "He said it was probably just a silly joke, and that Sophie Big Day should not start with an argument." The breeze lifted the corner of the banner again, and the glittered letters flashed briefly in the sunlight. For the first time that afternoon, I felt something inside me become very still. Not angry, not shocked, just clear. I finished the lemonade in one slow sip and placed the empty cup on the table beside me while the sounds of the birthday party continued around us exactly as they had before. I stood there for a moment after Carol finished speaking, listening to the sounds of the party as if they were coming from far away. Laughter near the pool. The soft buzz of conversation under the canopy. The faint music drifting from the small speaker on the patio table. Nothing in the yard had changed, yet something inside me had settled into a calm I had not felt earlier that afternoon. I had spent years believing that patience could smooth over awkward moments in families. That if you gave people enough kindness, enough understanding, they would eventually return it. But standing there under the shade of that maple tree, watching the banner ripple lightly in the wind, I understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. Silence is not always kindness. Sometimes silence is simply permission. Carol placed her untouched cake on the edge of the table beside us. "I am sorry, Evelyn," she said quietly. I nodded once. There was no anger in my chest now, only clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives after confusion finally runs out of places to hide. Across the yard, Sophie had started opening the larger gifts now. Someone had given her a pair of headphones, and the teenagers cheered as she held them up for the camera. Melissa moved quickly beside the table, adjusting the angle of the decorations so the pictures would look perfect. Daniel laughed at something one of the neighbors said and took a sip from his soda. For a moment, I watched the three of them together. My son, his wife, my granddaughter. A small family standing at the center of a celebration that looked bright and warm from the outside. I realized then that none of them expected me to react. They expected me to do what I had always done. Smile politely. Pretend nothing unusual had happened. Leave quietly when the party ended. It had worked before. Many times. People grow used to patterns in families. They depend on them. I set the empty lemonade glass down beside Carol's plate and slowly walked toward the gift table again. Sophie glanced up when I approached. The silver bag I had brought earlier was still sitting unopened beside the other presents. I picked it up gently and held it out toward her. "This one is from me," I said softly. "You may want to open it later when things are calmer." Sophie nodded quickly. "Thank you, Grandma," she said again, her voice polite but distant. I smiled at her the same way I had smiled when she was 5 years old and proudly showed me a drawing she had made in school. Then I stepped back from the table and looked around the yard one more time. The banner fluttered again behind the fence line. The music grew louder as someone changed the song. The party carried on exactly as it had before I arrived. But something inside me had shifted in a quiet and permanent way. I no longer felt the need to compete with the noise of that afternoon. I did not need to argue or raise my voice or make a scene. There are moments when dignity is not about fighting for your place in a room. Sometimes dignity means realizing you no longer need that room at all. I turned toward the gate and began walking slowly across the patio while the laughter and music continued behind me. And for the first time that afternoon, I felt completely certain about what I would do next. I walked slowly across the patio toward the open gate, the same way someone leaves a movie theater before the credits finish rolling. The music behind me shifted to a louder song, and a burst of laughter followed it, but no one called my name. No one asked where I was going. I reached the gate and rested my hand on the cool metal latch for a moment before stepping out onto the driveway. The late afternoon sun had begun to soften, casting long shadows across the quiet street. For a few seconds, I simply stood there beside my car, listening to the distant sounds of the party continuing behind the fence. It struck me then how easily a celebration moves forward once someone is no longer in the way of it. I opened the car door and placed my purse on the passenger seat, but I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I sat quietly, letting the air settle around me. My hands rested on the steering wheel while the memories of the afternoon replayed themselves one by one. The banner moving in the breeze. Daniel looking down at the grill. Melissa smiling as though everything was perfectly normal. Sophie waving from across the yard like I was someone visiting from a different life. None of those moments felt dramatic anymore. They felt deliberate. That was the word that kept returning to me. Deliberate. After a minute, I reached into my purse and took out my phone. There were already 3 photos on the screen that Carol had quietly sent while we were standing near the tree earlier. She must have taken them quickly when no one was looking. The pictures showed the banner clearly stretched across the fence before most of the guests had arrived. In the background, I could see Melissa adjusting the decorations while Sophie stood nearby, holding a box of balloons. They were both smiling. I looked at those images for several seconds before locking the screen again and setting the phone beside me. The street was calm. A dog barked somewhere down the block, and a car rolled slowly past the corner. It was an ordinary neighborhood afternoon, the kind people imagine when they think about peaceful American suburbs. Yet I realized that something important had just changed for me. For years I had filled quiet gaps in my son's household without anyone noticing. When Daniel's car broke down 2 winters ago, I paid for the repairs so he could keep getting to work. When Sophie needed tutoring in middle school, I covered the cost of the classes. Last summer, when the air conditioner in their house stopped working during a heat wave, I wrote the check that replaced it before the temperature reached 90 degrees inside. I had done those things without mentioning them to anyone, because that is what family means to me. You step forward where you are needed, and you do not ask for applause afterward. But sitting there in my car, I understood something with a calm certainty that surprised me. Quiet help is only meaningful when it is respected. When it becomes invisible, it slowly turns into expectation. And expectation eventually turns into entitlement. I started the engine then and adjusted the rearview mirror. Through the gap in the fence, I could still see flashes of pink balloons and moving figures in the backyard. The party was continuing exactly as it had before. I shifted the car into reverse and slowly backed out of the driveway, already knowing that the next time my presence changed the atmosphere in that house it would. Not be because I stayed. I drove home slowly that evening, keeping the windows slightly open while the warm summer air moved through the car. The roads were familiar, streets I had traveled hundreds of times over the years while picking Sophie up from school events, grocery shopping for family dinners, or stopping by Daniel's house with bags of homemade soup when someone caught a cold. Everything along the drive looked the same as it always had. The small park near the corner where Sophie learned to ride a bicycle when she was 6. The pharmacy where I had filled Daniel prescriptions after he injured his shoulder 2 years ago. The quiet rows of houses with their trimmed lawns and American flags moving gently in the breeze. Yet the drive felt different because my understanding of those familiar places had shifted. When I pulled into my own driveway, the sun had already dipped lower in the sky, painting the front of my house with a soft orange glow. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet ticking sound the car makes as it cools down. My house looked exactly the way it had that morning when I left for the party. The white porch railing, the small flower bed I had planted with blue hydrangeas, the same front door that Sophie used to run through when she visited on weekends years ago. I walked inside and set my purse on the kitchen table before pouring myself a glass of water. The house was peaceful, the kind of calm that settles naturally when you live alone long enough to appreciate silence. I sat down at the table and turned my phone on again. The photos Carol had sent were still there. In the background of one picture, Melissa was standing near the fence, smiling while adjusting the decorations. In another, I could see Sophie holding a bundle of balloons while the banner hung clearly above them. No confusion. No accident. Just a decision that had been made days before I arrived. I placed the phone down carefully and folded my hands together on the table. Over the years, I had quietly helped Daniel family more times than I could count. Tuition payments for Sophie tutoring classes. Emergency repairs for the house. Holiday gifts that were far more expensive than anyone realized. I had never kept track of the numbers because love does not usually carry a receipt. But that evening I realized something that felt both painful and strangely freeing. Help that is never acknowledged slowly loses its meaning. When kindness becomes invisible, people begin to assume it will always be there. I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my household records. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over the papers and envelopes neatly arranged in the drawer. I opened the top folder and looked at several documents I had not reviewed in months. Property records, investment statements, a few letters from my attorney regarding estate planning that we had discussed earlier that spring. At the time, those papers had simply been part of normal preparation for the future. Now they carried a different kind of weight. I closed the folder slowly and rested my hand on top of it for a moment. Outside, the evening air had grown quieter and the last colors of the sunset were fading behind the trees. I understood now that respect inside a family is not something you can demand with words. It is something people either choose to give you or they reveal that they never intended to give at all. And if they make that choice clear enough, the most powerful response is not anger. It is distance. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, and not because I was hurt in the dramatic way people expect when something unpleasant happens. It was quieter than that. I lay in bed looking at the ceiling while the house around me settled into the gentle creaks that old homes make after midnight. My mind moved slowly through the years behind me, remembering small moments that once felt ordinary but now carried a different meaning. The first time Melissa politely suggested that Sophie was too busy to visit on weekends. The way Daniel had gradually stopped asking for my opinion on family decisions. The careful way certain conversations seemed to happen only after I had already left the room. None of it had seemed important at the time. But when enough small moments gather together, they eventually tell a story, whether you want to hear it or not. When the morning light finally came through the kitchen window, I made a pot of coffee and sat down at the table with the folder I had looked at the evening before. The papers inside were simple records, things most people prepare as they get older. Property documents for my house. Investment accounts I had built slowly during 30 years of work at the library. A few letters from my attorney confirming that the estate plan we discussed earlier in the year was still unfinished. I read through them carefully while the coffee cooled beside me. For most of my life, I had imagined that everything I owned would eventually flow naturally toward Daniel and Sophie. That is the quiet assumption many parents carry without thinking about it. You work hard, you save what you can, and someday the next generation benefits from the stability you built. But that assumption depends on something deeper than paperwork. It depends on respect. And respect cannot be written into a will. I closed the folder and picked up my phone. My attorney answered after the second ring with the calm voice of someone already halfway through a busy morning. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes. I explained that I wanted to complete the estate plan we had postponed earlier that spring and that I had made some decisions about where my assets should eventually go. Several local programs in our city help children who struggle with reading, and the Library Foundation had been expanding those efforts every year. When I finished explaining, my attorney paused for a moment before asking if I was certain. I told him that I was completely certain. After the call ended, I carried my coffee to the living room window and looked out across the quiet street. A neighbor was walking her dog past the mailbox and a delivery truck rolled slowly down the block. It was another ordinary morning in the same neighborhood where I had lived for decades. Yet the calm inside me felt stronger than it had the day before. Later that afternoon, my phone finally rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. His voice sounded confused when I answered. "Mom, did you leave early yesterday?" he asked. "Melissa said she did not see you after the cake." I told him yes. I had gone home before the party ended. There was a pause on the line, the kind that happens when someone senses something has changed but cannot quite identify what it is yet. Are you upset about something? He asked carefully. I looked out the window again, while the silence stretched between us. No, Daniel, I said quietly. I am not upset anymore. And for the first time since the banner moved in the breeze behind that backyard fence, every word I spoke felt completely true.